Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on the time zone in which you are. On behalf of my colleagues and co-coordinators, Diana Mendez, Pedro Urquijo, Alfredo Cureco, Timothy Lorek, and Antonio Chamorro, I welcome you to the Interinstitutional Global Seminar on Green Revolution, an academic space supported by the Colegio Mexiquense, the Dr. José María Luis Mora Research Institute, and the Environmental Geography Research Center of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. It's a big pleasure to have your presence today in this fourth session of this seminar in which we're going to discuss the case of Africa, the Green Revolution in Africa. But before to give the floor to our moderator, I have to say you that one of our speakers, Klara Fischer, had to withdraw because personal issues. It's a shame, but well, these things happen. Well, with that being said, I give the floor to Adrián Ghilardi, the moderator of today's session. Ghilardi is professor at the Environmental Geography Research Center of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Professor Ghilardi, please go ahead. And thank you for having your presence today.
No, please. Thank you very much. It's an honor to participate in this international seminar. I say hi to all my friends in some African countries that I've just shared the link. We don't see each other in a long time. So as the title of this seminar reads, 80 years have passed since the beginning of the Green Revolution. And I believe the word revolution here is pretty much in tune. We humans were able for a third time in history to develop and apply technology that resulted overall in a dramatic increase in crop yields. But in a world where more than half of the population lives in poverty, no revolution whatsoever have brought equity so far. From an historical perspective, we might be better now than in the past, but this is measured in relative terms, and China's growth masked regional imbalances that have been going on too long. So this seminar is a timely contribution to the topic of how the Green Revolution impacted in the well-being of the African continent and what lessons we learned that could help us better understand and plan rural development strategies for the future. Of course, all this with the added complication that these strategies and programs and projects are to be increasingly threatened by climate change and wars and violence that do not stop popping out. So today you will have the honor to listen to two outstanding presenters, Ms. Lidia Cabral and Mr. Oluwatoyin Kolawole from Botswana. I will share their bio. Give me just a second. So Lidia Cabral is a research fellow with the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. She's a social scientist working across disciplines. Her work centers on the policies of food, South-South relationships, and the power of discourse in driving policy and constructing identities. Her latest research focuses on the histories of the Green Revolution in Brazil, India, and China, exploring how narrative about the past shape the international circulation of knowledge and contemporary technology transactions in the global South. She is also interested in researching equity, justice, and territoriality in food systems, all very relevant issues. So Toyin Kolawole, it's Oluwatoyin, there Kolawole obtained his PhD and master's degree in Ife, Nigeria, and Sussex, England, respectively. He's a professor of rural development at the Okavango Research Institute at the University of Botswana in Southern Africa. Professor Kolawole is an adjunct faculty at Eastern University based in St. Davis, Pennsylvania, US. He's working at the interface of science, policy, and agriculture in Africa. His research interests are in social change diffusion studies, nature resources management, rural development, and the intersection of local and Western knowledge innovations in sustainable, low external input agriculture. He has published well over 120 papers covering rural development subjects in research journals, books, conference proceedings, and other outlets. A UC visiting Canterbury Fellow in 2014 and Codesria Laureate in 1994-2006, Dr. Kolawole is a recipient of over 30 academics awards and research travel grants and has led and managed some multidisciplinary pro-poor development research and projects funded both locally and internationally. He has attended over 60 regional international conferences and workshops in Africa, Asia, Europe, North and South America, and the Oceania. Professor, have been all over the world. Professor Kolawole is a lead and scoping expert for the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, since 2016. He is also an external reviewer for the European Commission and other international multilateral agencies. In 2016, the Lesotho Council for Higher Education appointed him as chairperson of the panel of experts that review the Bachelor in Agriculture Economics program at the National University of Lesotho. He was also appointed by the CHE as a member of experts that review this agricultural extension program of the new NUL in the first and second quarters of 2017. Finally, Professor Kolawole was also a member of the panel of experts that reviewed the agricultural economics program of the Northwest University in the Mafi campus of South Africa in July 2020. He's a verified peer review for several well-recognized scientific journals published by Taylor and Francis, John Wheeler, Rochlet, Sprinkle, Emerald, Elsevier, all of them. He's an editorial board member of SAGE, Open, and the International Journal of Sociology and Agriculture and Food. So, as you just heard, we have two tremendously talented presenters that will give a relatively short presentation between 20-25 minutes each. Then we will go into quick Q&A section. So I'm not sure, Netza, shall we share their presentations?
Well, now it's time to give the floor to Lidia for starting the presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Buenos días, Mexico. Good afternoon or good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and to share this session with Professor Kolawole. So I'll just share my screen now. So hopefully the cover slide is now visible. And I'll start with my presentation. So first, a word of warning, actually. So this is a panel focused on green revolutions in Africa. Quite a big chunk of my presentation is actually going to talk about Brazil. But with a purpose to then arrive at what Brazil's interactions with Africa have meant and the multiple meanings associated with green revolutions. So I was hoping to be one of 4 panelists. We're now reduced to 2. So I was hoping that my focus on Brazil would be less of an issue, but I understand that the audience was expecting to hear mainly about Africa, and they're going to get a little bit less from my presentation, but hopefully Professor Kolawole will then complement this and address this issue. So let me now get started. So in my presentation, I want to consider the circulation of green revolutions from south to south, with a focus on Embrapa in Africa and the multiple meanings and agendas associated with this. And Embrapa is the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, a government-funded research organization at the center of the Brazilian agricultural science system and the Brazilian Green Revolution, as I will explain. So using Embrapa in Africa as an illustration, I want to argue that the international circulation of the Green Revolution is an enduring hegemonic project of technoscience, capital, and geopolitical assertion. The technoscientific venture continues to run into trouble as it repeats a formula that I regard as failed of transfers that disregard context. The capital and geopolitical ventures take on new forms that reflect a changing context, including the rise of the South and an increasingly globalized corporate food regime. But this hegemonic project has also met quite a lot of resistance, which is also equally increasingly globalized. And I will explain, I will illustrate how. So in this presentation, I want to draw from two research projects. One is a project that focused on development cooperation involving Brazil and China in Africa, whose findings were published in a World Development Special Issue back in 2016. The other is a more recent project, which focuses on the domestic experiences with green revolutions in Brazil, China, and India. And I'll refer to the two papers that you see there on the right-hand side of the slide. And hopefully these papers, these materials have been circulated ahead of this seminar today. So I want to just give you an overview of my presentation briefly. I'll start by situating my argument in relation to two theses that many of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with. One is about the geopolitics of the Green Revolution, focusing specifically on the influence of the United States. And the other one is about the Green Revolution as an enduring hegemonic project. I'll say a little bit more about it in a minute. I then want to make the case for green revolutions in plural as a way of drawing attention to other influences and imperatives besides the US and the Cold War. I then engage with the idea of the long green revolution through the concept of epic narratives that I will explain. And I will finally come to Africa, using Brazil's green revolution experience and its internationalization to illustrate the argument that I presented just before. So let me start with a simple definition of the Green Revolution, its geographical location and figurehead. So the Green Revolution is typically located between the late 40s and 80s of the previous century, depending on the context. It is usually agreed to have been a top-down state and science-led process that involved rolling out high-yielding varieties responsive to chemical fertilizers and irrigation. Its aim was to intensify production and productivity, and it did manage to in many locations, and reportedly address concerns with food insecurity and hunger. It started off in Mexico and then spread it around the world to India, Pakistan, Philippines, and other countries. The person you see depicted there on the right, Norman Borlaug, is the American scientist who is usually referred to as the father of the Green Revolution, or as Jim Sandberg and colleagues have put it, the brand hero of the Green Revolution. So let me now refer to the two theses that I want to situate my argument against. First, I mentioned to the work on the geopolitics of the Green Revolution, which has produced very insightful and influential perspectives on, especially on the role of the US government, development aid, and philanthropy in the construction, including the discursive construction and the spreading of Green Revolution technologies and narratives. So I reference here the work by Nick Lather, John Perkins, that I'm sure everyone knows very well and have referenced quite significantly in their work. And I also want to reference here a text by Brian Wright, which perhaps it's less known, which I find interesting because it describes the work by American philanthropy, particularly Rockefeller and Ford foundations, as grand missions of agricultural innovation that powered the Green Revolution. So it does reinforce a narrative focused on the centrality of American philanthropy in driving, empowering the Green Revolution. The second body of work or thesis that I want to reference here as quite influential, particularly in my way of looking at the Green Revolution, is the work by Raj Patel, published in an article in published by the Journal of Peasant Studies back in 2013, where the article is called The Long Green Revolution, where he argues that the Green Revolution is not a time-bounded episode in history of agricultural science and politics, but it endures as a project, as a biopolitical project by states and corporations seeking to control nature. So the Green Revolution is not over. The Green Revolution continues in time, being referred to in different ways. So he also argues that the periodicization of the Green Revolution itself, the idea that there was a first Green Revolution, a second Green Revolution, and other ways of referring to different stages in time, that's in itself a political endeavor that is trying to shield the first Green Revolution and protect it from criticism and present it as a success, as being in the distant past and therefore not protected from being challenged. So building on these and other perspectives, together with my colleagues Poonam Pandey and Shuli Xu, I have explored the domestic politics of green revolutions in countries that are today global agricultural powers, including Brazil, China, and India. So looking at the experiences in these three countries, we found other heroes and success narratives connected to domestic contexts and concerns by national governments at the time. A newly established People's Republic of China in the 1950s, a newly independent India in the 60s, and Brazil as a country under a military dictatorship in the 70s. And we explore the domestic narratives and ways of talking about the Green Revolution in these three countries. In China, the emphasis on scientific farming as portrayed as embodying the modernization of peasant agriculture and the deployment of science and technology as an instrument of class struggle, nation building, and modernization. India, a classic case of the Green Revolution that we looked at, with the 1960s described as the beginnings of scientific agriculture that saved the newly independent country from hunger. And then finally, Brazil, an experience that focuses on the expansion of modern farming in the Cerrado since the 1970s, as I mentioned, and this period being regarded the period of science-driven tropical revolution, which enabled an industrialization process and released pressure over land in the south of the country. So, in the paper, we developed the concept of epic narrative, building on these three countries' experiences to explain how this perceived past episode endures, as Raj Patel tells us, and continues to have so much influence in the way that agricultural science and technology are understood and practiced. So we define epic narratives as storylines about the past that produce meaning and empower those that articulate them, being individuals, organizations, or governments. The epic refers specifically to heroes, great feats, great dangers located in a distant past and hence shielded from criticism. And here we're drawing not only on Raj Patel's work, but also connecting with Russian philosopher Batkin, who talks about the epic and what the epic does in ways of relating to the past episodes, origin moments in the foundation of a nation, and so on. So with variations across countries, we analyze epic narratives of Green Revolution that talk about record increases in yields achieved through genetically superior varieties coupled with other modern inputs, driven by determined states and dedicated scientists to avoid starvation and feed growing populations. So such narratives are linked, we argue, to a positivist epistemology that is celebratory of science and a Malthusian worldview that sees hunger and food insecurity as resulting from the lack of food availability rather than structural inequities in the distribution of food and other resources indeed. These narratives celebrate a techno-economic paradigm that emphasizes the primacy of science and technology and increasing yields and competitiveness in line with the dominant corporate food regime. In the paper, we discuss two processes in which these epic narratives are made and then replicated over time. One is about creating the narrative through symbols, heroes, and establishing a sense of legacy or heritage. And the other is making modifications to the narrative to safeguard the epic idea. So the modifications are made in line with changing values and ideas of the time, including recently a focus on sustainability, low carbon agriculture, food safety, and so on. So in this particular presentation, I'll focus just on the first of these two processes, but in the paper that I mentioned at the start, we discussed this in more detail. So let me now describe briefly the epic narrative of the Brazilian Green Revolution, which I then want to connect to in relation to the Brazil-Africa interaction. So the historic moment, as I said, is initiated in the 70s and until the 80s, roughly, if we consider that first stage, a time when Brazil was under a military dictatorship. And so thinking about how the epic elements of the narrative, we identify great feats that we see talked about in the literature, including the so-called conversion of the Cerrado biome in the center of the country. We see depicted there on the right. As the sort of the great achievement during this period, the conversion of the Cerrado, until then considered an unproductive land, into modern agriculture. And then specifically looking at particular technologies, achievements that were made at the time, and specifically in the Cerrado. These include the adaptation of soybean varieties to the tropical conditions of that biome, breeding of varieties of rhizobium, a bacterium that helps fixate nitrogen in legumes, reducing the need for fertilizer, and the improvement of grasses such as varieties of brachiaria, which actually came from the African continent, and that improved soil structure and enabled livestock farming at scale in the Cerrado. In terms of great perils, of dangers that are emphasized in connection to this story, we see a description of the threat of the loss of food self-sufficiency and social unrest due to pressure over land, particularly in the south of the country, as I mentioned before. And if we want to identify a heroic figure associated with the Brazilian Green Revolution, rather than one individual, we have an organization, Embrapa, that I now want to focus on. So Embrapa is one of the world's largest publicly funded agricultural research organizations. It employs just over 8,000 people, of which about 1,700 are researchers with PhDs. And the organization is organized in a way that it has a centralized structure and then decentralized units all across this massive country. And you'll see there depicted in the slide the different units of Embrapa, which focus either on crops or biomes or other cross-cutting themes and services. So Embrapa was established in 1973 with strong support from the military regime. And in one of the papers that I mentioned at the start, I analyzed how the history of this organization is seen from within. So I looked at Embrapa Memoria, Memory Embrapa, which was an initiative celebrating the organization's 50th anniversary. So this was in 2013. So I analyzed material which was then available at Embrapa's website, which included a timeline with milestones referring to particular technological achievements. It included also the profile of distinguished members of Embrapa, awards, and then many tributes by individual members of staff who recorded short videos celebrating the organization. So I analyzed all this material and the version of Embrapa's history that this material tells against other data on the history of the organization and what it has done over the years. And I concluded that the history that is celebrated by Memória Embrapa is a partial one. It celebrates some successes, it overlooks negative social and environmental impacts of the technologies that it celebrates, and disregards other important bodies of work produced by the organization that don't really fit the canons. And this include work with indigenous groups on maize conservation, for example, social innovations for family farmers, and work on agroecology. And in the paper, I give examples of those. So the celebration of Embrapa, that this 50th anniversary produces, generates a sense of organizational heritage within Embrapa, a concept that I borrowed from organizational theory, and which I argue gives Embrapa, the organization, legitimacy to present itself in the presence as the organization to imagine the future for science and technology. Despite this legitimacy that it takes from its celebratory past, being based on a partial interpretation of the organization's history. These are just some of the tributes that I analyzed, that simply here to illustrate how people within the organization feel strongly and very proud about being part of Embrapa, an organization that is tasked with the heroic responsibility of feeding not only Brazil, but also feeding the world. So it is with this sense of responsibility and pride that Embrapa goes to Africa, but I now want to argue that it doesn't go alone. So I now want to briefly explore how Embrapa in Africa is a multi-layered venture, including geopolitics, technoscience, capital, and social mobilization. And I'll give illustrations of that. So going back to 2006, President Lula da Silva, who was then the president of Brazil, was a strong enthusiast of Embrapa, of the Embrapa brand, which he talked about across Africa during his many visits. And in 2006, he inaugurated an Embrapa office in Ghana, in Accra, expecting that this office would become a hub for the continent as a whole, which would deliver a similar agricultural transformation to that presumably experienced in Brazil. So in his words at the time, he said, to have Embrapa in the city of Accra is the beginning of a peaceful revolution that will have as result the germination of grain, food products that can do in the African savannah the same revolution that Embrapa carried out in the Brazilian Cerrado. So in my work, I explored how scientific and technological cooperation was deployed as an instrument of soft power, establishing Brazil's authority in international development as a source of tropical solutions for developing countries. This office project in Ghana largely failed, and cooperation with the Ghanaian government on agricultural issues was never that significant. Ghana did not become an African hub for Brazilian cooperation. However, by contrast, Embrapa's presence in Mozambique on the other side of the continent flourished at the time. And this was, of course, seized by shared language, but also narratives that claimed biophysical similarities between Brazil and Mozambique, framed in a language of parallels. So the Cerrado experience and Embrapa's role take center stage in these narratives. In a book by Embrapa about cooperation in Mozambique that is depicted there, it's called Parallels, Corridor of Nacala. This book states the following: the Brazilian Cerrado and the Africa's savannas, separated during the formation of the continents, preserve similarities in terms of climate and soil. It is expected that Brazilian technologies developed for the Cerrado can be tested and validated in Nacala corridor. So, just to show you a picture from that book that gives you a graphical representation of this parallels idea that is used to express similarity and the possibility of transfer along this transatlantic corridor. The project that becomes the main initiative for such transfer is a project called Pro Savannah. that aim to turn the Nacala corridor, located in the north of Mozambique, into a highly productive farming region, replicating the experience of the Cerrado in Brazil through research and technology and extension services to farmers. This was highly problematic because first it assumed that the Cerrado transformation was a success story, and therefore disregarded the negative social and environmental legacy of this transformation in Brazil. And then the project ran into all series of problems that are typically associated with aid projects. And these include misunderstandings on both sides, the inability to turn scientific experiments into practices that are of interest to farmers. And so therefore a lot of wrong assumptions about each other's needs and aims. But Botswana was not just about scientific and technical cooperation. It was also a business venture that suited the interests of Brazilian businesses that were already present in this part of the country. And sorry, in the previous slide, I had depicted there the Nacala corridor in the north of Mozambique, and I can come back to that later if the audience wants to know more about this particular territory. But I wanted to say that in the Nacala corridor, you could already find quite a lot of Brazilian business interests, some of those businesses connected to international multilateral corporations. So the project aimed to attract large Brazilian farmers to invest in cheap land in Mozambique as a stepping stone to Asian markets. And the president of a cotton producers associations from Brazilian state in the Cerrado, the state of Mato Grosso, said in an interview at the time that Mozambique is the Mato Grosso in the middle of Africa, with zero cost land, without the environmental impediments that they had in Brazil, and much cheaper freight to Africa. So quite a problematic set of idea. And unsurprisingly, these and other similar declarations created a lot of discomfort on either side of the Atlantic. So I now want to briefly move to that despite much hype about Botswana and what it could achieve, including replicated a presumed success in the north of Mozambique, what indeed happened was that it didn't manage to attract much Brazilian investors to Mozambique because the conditions were considered to be too harsh. And instead it encouraged an unprecedented civil society mobilization, both in Brazil and in Mozambique, connected through transnational networks, including La Via Campesina. The scientific and technical exchange between Embrapa and its peers in Mozambique was interrupted due to lack of funding and controversy. And Botswana became hence instead a space for contestation against large-scale agriculture, top-down science, that ended up giving quite a bit of visibility and empowering agrarian social movements, both in Brazil and in Mozambique. And coming to my concluding slide now, I want to just go back to the start and emphasize how the global circulation of the Green Revolution is an enduring project, as indeed suggested by Raj Patel. Embrapa in Africa, and Botswana specifically, gives us an illustration of geopolitical assertion by the Brazilian diplomacy trying to rebalance global development and governance, techno-scientific assertion by orthodox agricultural science, whose strength is derived from the Green Revolution epic narrative, and capital advancement through the Brazilian agribusiness lobby and large corporations that are increasingly internationalized. But the resistance movement to the Green Revolution also becomes globalized, and this adds a further layer to the Embrapa presence in Africa, which challenges the heroic status of the organization. Now, as President Lula, who was previously proved to be quite an enthusiast about the Embrapa brand, as he returns to office in the next month, it will be interesting to see how Embrapa in Africa, how this story unfolds, and how it, given its bumpy trajectory this far, it will be interesting to see what the next chapter will look like. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lidia. Very clear, very interesting, your presentation. I believe, please correct me, Netza, if I'm wrong, that we should go with Professor Kolawole's presentation first, and then we start the Q&A section, isn't it?
Yes, that is
Okay.
the order.
So, Professor Kolawole, the stage is yours.
So, sorry, I'm not switching on my video because I seem to be having challenges when Lidia was presenting. It was frozen, so I then decided to switch it off. Can you see my presentation there?
Yeah, perfectly.
Great. So I'll be talking briefly on Green Revolution after 80 years, and we'll be sharing my perspective based on an Africanist experience, so to say. These are my outlines. I will briefly talk about the Green Revolution, then Africa, the Green Revolution, and environmental determinism. Then I will present 3 case studies from Nigeria, from Rwanda, and Ethiopia. You can see that I highlighted Nigeria in red because most of what I'll be drawing upon will be on Nigeria because it's really, really problematic, sort of. Then this last section will be addressing the vision that we have for a uniquely African Green Revolution. Yeah, an overview of the Green Revolution. I wouldn't want to dwell too much on this because many speakers have talked about how Green Revolution evolved. And of course, it came about in 1941 when the American Vice President Henry Agard Wallace told the president of the Rockefeller Foundation to increase the yield per acre of corn, and then that is in Mexico, and then by then he would have done so much for the country. He was actually concerned about the food crisis during the time, so he was trying to encourage the president of the Rockefeller Foundation to do something about it, and that's how the idea of Green Revolution came about. Even though he didn't use the term Green Revolution, it was actually William Gord, who happened to be the director of USAID at the time, that coined the term Green Revolution in 1968. And of course, the idea was just to make a contrast between the foreign policy of America and then against the violent activities of the Red Guerrilla movement at the time. And the American foreign policy was just about trying to promote peace through food production, reducing hunger, and the like. Then, of course, between 1940s and late 1970s, the Green Revolution evolved as a technological breakthrough in the development of high-yielding and disease-resistant cereal grain varieties. Of course, we all know what Norman Borlaug did through the process, and he eventually got a Nobel Prize for what he did for his scientific discovery. Having said that, I can then confidently say that the Green Revolution actually had started in the West long before the commencement of the GR itself in the rest of the world. So essentially, what the Green Revolution is all about is just about the diffusion of technological innovations in the global South, that is in the developing economies. Yeah. Then, of course, the Green Revolution underscores the achievement of food production efficiency, mainly in the developing world. And of course, in 1957, the Green Revolution quickly spread to Asia, where a series of successes were eventually recorded. And of course, in Asia, Marcos, Philippines, Indonesia, in India, those three leaders, Marcos, Suharto, and Gandhi, were actually promoting the use rice, roads, and schools to centralize power, and then to garner political support, such that they became so popular because of the achievement that they recorded through food production. And of course, agrarian reforms have been propelled mainly by two approaches, which are technological innovations and political economy of agricultural development. I'm going to share that with you in a moment. But of course, if we're all said and done, we cannot boast so specifically about the success that the Green Revolution has achieved in Africa because of so many diverse reasons, which I will share with you. And of course, the Ukrainian war that is still ongoing actually exposed the secret of Africa being so solely reliant upon food from the rest of the world. So for me, I don't think any green revolution has actually taken place if we still depend mainly on the food that is being imported to the continent, unfortunately. Of course, I am talking about the uniqueness of the African Green Revolution and its peculiar environment. There are barriers to developing sedentary agriculture on the continent. The first barrier is the high incidence of tropical diseases in those days. Malaria is still there. Trypanosomiasis, which we refer to as sleeping sickness, actually hampered agricultural development in those days, particularly in the tropics where you have tsetse fly that used to cause sleeping sickness to both humans and animals like oxen and horses, which of course should have been used to manage or to develop agricultural lands, as against what obtains in Eurasia, where animal draft power were used to develop the land. In Africa, that was a big problem in those days. And of course, Africa is not really endowed with navigable waterways, which has hampered transportation of agricultural products. And of course, the gradients of agroecology in Africa is diverse, such that a one-size-fits-all might not really work on the continent. So it is really a challenge. And again, tropical soils that are rich but easily degradable and or low in cation exchange capacity is another major problem on the continent. And of course, we all know that Africa is a rainbow continent where you have gradients of ecological environment. And when you go to the African savannas, you find cases, prolonged drought periods, which actually is affecting agricultural production. And of course, erratic rainfall patterns, which is witnessed in regions like East Africa, is one of those major problems that we are dealing with in Africa. Then generally, the Green Revolution has not really taken off in most part of Africa, given all those things, all those backgrounds that I've provided. Then I'm trying to show you the prevalence of undernourishment in Africa as against the rest of the world regions. If you take a look at this graph, you see this line represents Africa. You see, as at 2000, year 2000, about 25% of the population of Africa were undernourished. Then it began to decline up until 2020, when it is rising again, I think, due to COVID-19 that happened and affected the entire world. So essentially, if you take a look at this graph, you see that Africa is not really doing well in terms of the prevalence of undernourishment. And of course, I will show you this as well. When talking about food insecurity levels by region and gender, as of 2020, you can see the graph here that both men and women in Africa are food insecure, so to say. And of course, the world average is much less than what obtains in Africa. So you see, those red bars are those that are those areas that are referring to severe food security. And you see Africa tops all the regions in Asia, in Latin America, in North America, and the rest of the world. So essentially, what I'm trying to show us is that we really cannot say that we've really made a lot of progress in terms of being dependent. I mean, being independent on food that is produced on the continent. Then again, this is another graph that I'm trying to show in terms of food insecurity levels, which is based on the food insecurity experience scale by region. If you take a look at this graph again, you see in Africa, between 2014 and 2020, you can see that there is severe food insecurity in Africa, which was almost close to about 27% in 2020. And when you compare that to the rest of the world, you see Africa still seems to be is far ahead. It's not doing well in terms of food insecurity. So essentially what I'm trying to do here is to show you the situation that we're faced with in Africa in terms of food reliance. Yes, you may want to say that food insecurity may not necessarily translate to food production. I agree. People may be producing food and some will still not have access to the food, and then they get food, they are insecure in terms of food. But I think that there is a direct correlation between food insecurity and less food production as well. So that's what I'm trying to show you there. Having said that, I'll quickly go to the political economy of agrarian reforms. Nigeria as a case study. Yeah, the Nigerian agri sector did well before gaining independence in 1960. But of course, when the politicians and the leaders began to prioritize cash crops over and above staple crops, then that was the beginning of the problem for Nigeria just immediately after independence. And of course, when Nigeria discovered crude oil, petrol, in the early 1960s and then the boom in 1970s, then it became another problem because there was a shift. People began to shift attention from agriculture to oil exploration. And of course, the civil war that occurred between Nigeria and the eastern part of the country trying to sever away from Nigeria became another hindrance to agricultural development. And of course, resource allocation and management became a power relations and tussle between the North and South regions. I'm sure some of you know the history of Nigeria, how Britain tried to use divide and rule tactics to manage the affairs of the nation, and that became a problem between the North and the South. And of course, poor leadership, therefore, has been the bane of the Nigerian economy. And where you have poor leadership, then everything suffers. Yes, the structural adjustment program, SAP, of the 1980s actually hampered again agricultural development in Africa because the smallholder farmers who should be at the center of the Green Revolution became they bear the brunt of this of SAP because of the conditionalities that were imposed by the Bretton Woods, that is the World Bank. The World Bank said there should be a removal of subsidy, there should be rationalization, and so many things that happened then. And of course, it's the poor majority that suffers because of all this. So essentially, you see, these are the problems that have confronted Nigeria particularly. Then, of course, what are the features of the Nigerian Green Revolution? According to the scholar Conde, he said that the Nigerian Green Revolution favored the production capacity of export crop producers, as I've said earlier on, in the very first decade after independence. You see, the attention of Britain was to develop local capacities in terms of producing cash crops to feed the factories in Britain in those days. And that actually affected the production of staple food, which should have been a plus for Nigeria. Of course, a time it was when Nigeria used to be a very good producer of cocoa after Ghana and Ivory Coast. Now Nigeria cannot boast of anything called cocoa. There was a time when Nigeria used to be the best producer of palm oil. Malaysia that went to Nigeria to collect the germplasm of oil palm is now the best producer of palm oil in the world. Nigeria is nowhere to be found because our leaders de-emphasized the production of staple crops. And of course, the Green Revolution has been implemented under different names by different administrations. One of them is National Accelerated Food Production Projects. Operation Feed the Nation is one of them, Green Revolution itself. So essentially, we're saying that the Green Revolution came in different forms and in different names, in different nomenclatures in Nigeria, but it was just all the same thing every now and then, because you see, new administration that comes into power today will want to do something new. So eventually, there is no continuity in those initiatives, and then they get truncated, and then there is no result in the end of the day. Of course, the latest one is the growth enhancement scheme that was put in place by Goodluck Jonathan's government. It's just about trying to enhance smallholder farmers' accessibility to agricultural inputs. Whether that has actually translated to food production boom is another question to address. Again, some of those features that the initiatives are designed to achieve self-sufficiency in staple commodities like yam, cassava, millet, sorghum, maize, cowpeas, etc. And then the smallholder farmers who cultivate less than 5 hectares are central to the Nigerian Green Revolution. Like the Asian model, the Nigerian Green Revolution is technologically driven, but is externally propelled through sprinkler irrigation facilities, chemical inputs like Lidia mentioned, and of course, every speaker has spoken about that as well. So it's just all about heavy external input, and this really doesn't help the resource poor farmer who struggle to even access those inputs. Then, of course, market seems unfettered. On the surface, you think the market is okay, that is free to operate on its own, but the government will not let go because it oversees the provision, distribution, and pricing of inputs. And again, that became problematic because I'm going to talk about that in a short while. The Nigerian Green Revolution lacks indigenous capacities, which otherwise could have propelled agricultural transformation. So essentially, we're saying that the Green Revolution in Nigeria relied so heavily on external technologies, which farmers may not necessarily be able to relate with, and of course, some are expensive, some could not be adapted to local context, and that again became a problem for the farmer. And yes, the political and bureaucratic failings of the Nigerian Green Revolution are those information that I provided there. The pro policy reforms are induced by crisis situation and politics as usual. Of course, the country's inability to feed its teeming population since 1980s is really, really worrisome, and we still have an issue with that. It's there, everybody, if a Nigerian struggle by the day when it comes to food. And then, of course, each administration scores political points by immediately truncating previous government initiatives and replacing them with new ones. I've mentioned that before now. Then policymakers are easily influenced by their cronies and rent seekers who formulate policies that favor them. You see, external pressures from bilateral or multilateral agencies in policy development is another major problem. And then, of course, exigencies and personal interest, which constitute a barrier to proper policy reforms. Then the bureaucratic red tape, which is associated with the Green Revolution in Nigeria, where you have provision and distribution and pricing of producer inputs being politicized. Of course, a typical example of bureaucratic red tapeism is the land reform of 1978, which actually favors rent seekers and powerful elite than smallholder farmers who need the land more. See, even the government of the day, the government of Olusegun Obasanjo, who developed this reform, who came about the reform, benefited immensely by cornering a large chunk of land, and of course at the expense of the poor farmers. So what we're saying here is that red tapeism and corruption are those major issues that are confronting the Nigerian Green Revolution, which of course, is an issue to address. Then again, I've mentioned the issue of rent-seeking behavior of government officials who would intentionally jeopardize the benefits of Green Revolution because they are making profits from it. You see, the unintended beneficiaries of the policies introduced are aristocrats, town-dwelling farmers, people who are not really farmers. Those are the people who then make business, they cut business out of the process. They get inputs and then begin to resell to the hapless poor farmers. You see, they became input contractors and transport owners. Those are the people who actually benefited immensely from the process. And of course, the introduction of inappropriate technologies that are foreign to non-literate farmers, and then poor agricultural extension service delivery. Then, of course, the nature of the dispersal of indigent farmers. They are spread all over the place. They are not clustered, and that actually made them to be left out most of the time. And of course, the hydra-headed environmental and other challenges associated with Africa makes a one-size-fits-for-all approach to be very ineffective when we're talking about addressing the Green Revolution in Africa, because diverse contexts with diverse problems, which cannot be approached through just a straitjacket policy. But unfortunately, it appears that the approach that have been used over the years seem to be just like that. Then, of course, the attention of successive administration on crude oil, which I mentioned a while ago, then rendered the Nigerian economy a monolithic one. And of course, corruption, which is associated with oil block allocations and inflation of contracts, is another major problem that has bedeviled the Nigerian Green Revolution. Then, of course, I'll quickly move on to Rwanda's experience, which I'm going to talk to you briefly. What is the real impact of the Green Revolution in Rwanda? The analysis done by Dawson in 2015 indicates that policies support institutional and technological changes that are incongruent with local realities. You see, the policies that were developed institutionally and technological wise are not in tandem with the realities of local people, the smallholder farmers. Then policies encouraged a shift from the traditional polyculture system to specializing in cash crop economy, which of course is detrimental to the social, cultural lives of the people. Because naturally local farmers would want to grow diverse crops so that they can be secured. Just in case if one fails, then the other one works for them. But in this case, because of the introduction of a monoculture, then it became a problem. Then, of course, aggregated data indicated that Rwanda's Green Revolution resulted in increased yields and poverty alleviation. Yes, on the surface, it appears that the Green Revolution in Rwanda was a success story because yields of cereals increased and then poverty seemed to have been alleviated. But however, the national average of the gains recorded does not sync well with local farmers' experiences. It's different. When you go down to the grassroots, what the national average is saying is not really what the local experience is. So, and then relatively wealthy few individuals were able to adhere to the enforced modernization agenda, which of course is at the expense of the poor majority. And the policies of Green Revolution aggravated landlessness and inequality in poor rural communities. The crop intensification program of Rwanda and the land use policy that they put in place are actually disadvantaged the small farmers who really couldn't meet up with the conditions set by the government. And when they then don't meet the conditions, their lands are being taken away from them. So it's like it's back to square one. They are just being boxed into a corner. Then disruption of rural household subsistence practices and land tenure security and autonomy, and then of course local knowledge. All those things are affected when we're talking about monoculture. It affects so many things, particularly the local knowledge of farmers, because they tend to be restrained. They are restricted in terms of using their knowledge to manage their environment, and of course the impairment of labor and local trade. For instance, where local communities in different locations have been trading by by barter through production of crops on the basis of comparative advantage. When the government now says, no, you have to grow cash crops, everybody, then it means that that component of their social life has been totally erased. Then again, I want to quickly talk about the Green Revolution in Ethiopia. Based on Emil Thiel's analysis, the results show that the Green Revolution in Ethiopia occurred in the mid-1990s and has since then gained momentum starting from 2004. I highlighted them in green, this point that I'm trying to show you in green, because they appear to be a success story of some sort. Number one, agricultural production and productivity in Ethiopia increased from 1995 to 2018. Their productivity has been driven by yield improvements rather than agricultural land expansion since 2007. So this is all about intensification. Rather than use a large expanse of land to produce, it appears that Ethiopia is getting it right by cultivating just a small portion of lands, and they're able to get more from that. That is agricultural efficiency. Then the country's GR, which is Green Revolution, is characterized by small farmers, staple crops, and areas of high agricultural potential. Unlike what obtained in Nigeria, you see, emphasis is being placed on staple crops here. And of course, they focus their attention on areas that have high agricultural potential. Then more than 95% of land use and production in Ethiopia are accounted for by small farmers. Cereals accounted for 59-27% of total agricultural production in the period 1995 to 2018. And of course, the two regions with comparatively favorable agricultural conditions accounted for over 81% of agricultural production. And of course, agricultural public spending in infrastructure and extension enhanced the success of a GR in Ethiopia. And lastly, the country's Green Revolution implementation is situated within local context and not purely exogenous. And I think that's part of why they're able to record a great success in what they're doing. Having said, I just want to say, generally, we cannot really celebrate the Green Revolution in Africa, because when we talk about the reality on the ground, Africa is still very food insecure. So if we are saying that at this time that we're relying on Ukraine to bring grains, when the war broke out and then grains were not coming, then it became a crisis. It became a crisis. So I personally feel that we haven't really taken off. I was privileged, this will be the last slide. I was privileged to be a part of the conference and workshop that took place in Salzburg in 2008 on a uniquely African Green Revolution. The conference and workshop was organized by the Institute of Development Studies, where Lidia is now, and Future Agriculture's Consortium, and then Salzburg Global Seminar. And of course, the program was put in place in honor of Kofi Annan, of now blessed memory. He was still alive at the time, and of course, we met in person. He was at the event. So during the workshop and the deliberations, what people agreed on was that there is a need for a uniquely African Green Revolution, which is conceived to be a holistic farmer and environment-friendly initiative. And of course, all participants agree that a new African Green Revolution should be inward-looking instead of relying solely on external donors. So some of those cross-cutting issues that came out of the deliberations were that there was need for human capacity development for us to achieve a uniquely African Green Revolution. Number two, there should be knowledge production and dissemination. Number three, there should be creation of farmers' fund and agricultural insurance, because of course, farming is a risk, is a high risk venture. So insurance is very important for small farmers. Enhancing the delivery of public goods or infrastructure through the public sector is one of them. Then empowering public extension services is key to agricultural information dissemination. building synergies through the new Partnership for Africa's Development, Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, which is KADA, is one of them. Then strengthening the peer review mechanism of NEPAD, which is talking about making all governments on the continent to do something about revolutionizing the agriculture. So it's just all about peer reviewing. And I think, I don't know how far they've gone with that. Then the last bit, one point there is that there was need for the creation of spaces for indigenous innovations. Yes, we've talked about that extensively, that if we are going to develop, we need to look inward. We need to develop local indigenous technologies. Nobody is saying that local innovations should be alone. They should be integrated with Western technologies. That is when things will work properly. And of course, the last one is that there is need to enhance community-based and private sector initiatives. Of course, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which was championed by Kofi Annan himself, is doing a great job along that line. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kolawole, for your insights on these countries. Very interesting, both presentations. So Netza, let me know how we follow up. After listening to the presentations, I came up with 3 questions, but
Yes.
shall I go on with that?
I think maybe we can open a space for the interaction between Lidia and Oluwatoyin. Maybe if they have some comments, and if not is the case, maybe we can open after the space for the attendance.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to, can I?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yes, I love Lidia's presentation. Very colorful and it's a high standard presentation, and I appreciate that. I just wanted to know more about MBRAPA, that organization. Is it a government organization or an international NGO? Because I could see that Lula actually really talked very well about the organization. Is it government owned or is it a private organization? That wasn't clear to me in the presentation.
I can clarify that straight away, if I may, Adrian.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. No, it is a government a research organization that was established by the military regime, has always been inside government structures. It has a particular model of functioning. So it has quite specific regulation. And indeed, its researchers, they are not typical civil servants, but they are subject to a different sort of model whereby they get a different salary. They have quite a lot of autonomy. But it is a mainly government-funded organization. They do mobilize also, they do get access to private sources of funding to carry out particular projects, but on the whole, the organization and its staff are paid by public funding. And that's quite, actually, that raises quite a lot of questions on what a publicly funded organization, whether a public funded organization should have a social role to play in society and therefore should prioritize a particular set of actors, of beneficiaries in its work. I can carry on that, but I'll stop there for now.
Okay,
thank you
very much. Yeah. Okay, so sure. Yeah, go ahead, Lidia. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'd like to just make a brief comment to Toyin's presentation, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I thanks very much for very informative, all those details about the experiences of these different countries, and to show how disappointing to some extent the promise of a green revolution has been. And just to say also that I broadly agree with the idea that African countries and the continent needs a holistic, people-centered, environmentally sustainable initiative. I think that's all very good, and that would be welcome. But I'm just unsure whether the Green Revolution label is at all needed to prefix that type of initiative, because there is a lot of evidence from other contexts that indeed the Green Revolution hasn't been that holistic or people-centered or environmentally sustainable. So perhaps we need to have another label. And I just wanted to perhaps highlight how I think that there is a fundamental problem with the Green Revolution in terms of the model, in terms of the metrics, and in terms of the mentality that are kind of underpinning the idea of the Green Revolution. I think, as Stein was saying, it's quite problematic that very often we see these initiatives being centered on singular crops, often export crops. How itself the focus on yields and competitiveness can be problematic from if your concern is environmental sustainability or social justice, distribution, food security, and so on. And then I also wanted to perhaps highlight the problem of the fundamental mentality of scientists and technicians and indeed governments that get behind these ideas, that tend to assume that farmers are ignorant, that they're passive takers of solutions that come from the top, and how they really disregard experiential knowledge, and they indeed, I think, put forward ideas that kind of reinforce their privileged status in the system, either scientists or government bureaucrats. So on the whole, I think, I support the broader message in Toyn's presentation, but I just have some question marks on whether we really need to be talking about the Green Revolution in Africa, where that's indeed at all desirable.
Do you want me to respond to the sorry, I lost you at some point, like I said, because the whole thing just got frozen. But from what you said, I totally agree with your comment. And yes, of course, it is erroneous for people to think that farmers don't have the knowledge or what it takes to do something great. And I was reading Frank Emma's article that actually elucidated on that, about how farmers were able to adapt, West African farmers particularly, were able to adapt even exotic crops within their own environment. Rice, for instance, cassava, for instance, and I think maize. All those ones are foreign to, they are not indigenous to West Africa, but farmers were able to adapt those crops to their environment. So essentially what we're saying is that farmers, they have the ability to adapt and to make things happen if the right environment is created for them to operate. The problem with us is that we tend to see them as very empty barrel that doesn't know anything, they don't know anything. And when that happens, they close up, they shut down, because they are not going to allow you to ride over them, because they believe that they have what it takes to do the right thing. So I agree with you totally, and I say thank you for that.
Nice. Thank you, Lidia. Do you have any extra comment? No? Okay, shall we move into a few questions, Netza? I'm not sure how the external questions we will do that. You will post them?
There are 3 questions in the chat.
Okay. So I'll start with mine. I have 3. I need to rebrand them, because after listening to your presentations and listening to your exchange, I will try to play a little of devil advocates here. So, we heard of unequivocally negative impacts and accomplished goals in each of this handful, in a handful of countries: Nigeria, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Mozambique. I don't know, jeopardizing small farmers, rampant corruption, inequity, these aggregate values that looks cool, but then small farmers are not benefit in the slightest. So that is pretty clear, like a very clear-cut critique to all these green revolution. But is there any way that we can pull some true part of this epic narrative, as Lidia mentioned, or should we brand every green revolution efforts as a failure and start from square one, as Toyin said? Is there something that we can bring back? That is my general question. And then I have two specific ones it's for both of you, but these are my specific questions. So Lidia mentioned at the beginning of her presentation that the Green Revolution keeps growing or almost being reborn, and Professor Kolawole as well. So it's not something that started and ended. It's been morphed into different beasts. So my question is, how does climate change mitigation has been integrated by this rebranding and ever-growing Green Revolution-based programs that started 80 years ago? That's one. So how climate change is being taken into account each year furthermore, I believe. And the other one that brought my attention was some conclusion that Professor Kolawole mentioned, that the new Green Revolution should gain strength from the inside rather than relying on the outside. My understanding is that since 80 years to now, so there are a lot of technology and supplies that might be produced locally rather than being exported. So the capacity of certain countries to produce their own technology or being helped by South-South cooperation, as the case of Brazil, might be a trigger for this originally weakness that Green Revolution need imported technology and supplies to perhaps something that is not so bad, in the sense that locally some of these technologies that might have an impact on yields might be produced locally. So those are the three questions, and I don't have them for any of you. Just raise your hand. I hope they make sense.
Should I go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Professor Kolawole.
Yeah, if I heard you clearly, you were talking about, yes, we've talked about the negatives of Green Revolution all over the place. And that is there anything we can learn or build upon to move on? Is that a question?
Yes, basically that's it.
Yeah, of course, it's not all totally tales of woes. There are aspects of the African Green Revolution that can be built upon, and of course, the success story of Ethiopia is a point of departure, if I may say, that if we do the right thing, and then the smallholder farmers who are actually the bulk of food producers are concentrated upon, and their knowledge systems are promoted, and they are allowed to adapt foreign technologies to suit their own environment, why the government is creating an enabling environment for that. I think it's a good point of departure for Africa to take off. And the idea of bringing in this monolithic culture is not going to work for Africa, because majority of African farmers are smallholders, and they are poor, and they like to grow different crops for food security sake. If you then encourage them to begin to grow just one crop, then it becomes a problem, because it's going to affect so many things. It's going to affect their culture. It's going to affect their social life. It's going to affect many things. So basically, what we're saying is that when we want to promote this Green Revolution thing, we need to situate the farmer within the context of the thrust of the Green Revolution. That's my response to that question. Then the second one on climate change, which I saw I read that, the challenges that the Green Revolution members face to fight climate change, food shortages, dominance of economies, government, and genetic manipulation. Of course, I've written a paper on GMOs, which of course appear to be polemic, but it's not. Yes, climate change is a major issue that every part of the world is contending with. And of course, it is the poor economies that will bear the brunt of the whole thing. We are seeing it is happening. So we saw what happened in Pakistan just about a few months ago, where the whole place got flooded and many people died. Of course, in Nigeria, it happened recently as well. So climate change is an important component that we need to look into when driving green revolution. How do we, the only approach to that is to develop climate smart innovations that would answer the need of the local farmers in the end. And of course, the issue of the genetically modified organisms that we refer to as GMOs has been an issue. And of course, I've been one of those pushers. I've been making arguments concerning Monsanto, Syngenta, and some other multinational corporations because of what they are doing. My impression is that those corporations are trying to create market for their products at the expense of local indigenous organisms, of course, plants. I mean, when you encourage farmers to grow just one crop that you cannot even allow them to develop their own seed, then it becomes a problem. Farmers cannot develop seeds. They will have to rely on the suppliers of those seeds for them to grow their crops. So it then becomes, biodiversity issue then becomes an issue. It becomes problematic because when we begin to encourage monolithic agriculture, then it means that so many other things will get jeopardized. And of course, the use of chemical fertilizers and herbicides may not necessarily suit all the conditions in Africa. I just mentioned the issue of low cation exchange capacity in African soils. Let us assume that you have a very fertile soil. If the cation exchange capacity is low, there is no way through which crop plants will be able to uptake those nutrients. And the answer is not chemical fertilizers. It is through organic mineralization. That is where the knowledge of local farmers can in. You need to recognize the fact that local farmers have their indigenous approaches that they've used over many years, several decades, in which they used to maintain their soil fertility. If that is not considered, then it then becomes a major problem. That's why you see people keep on applying fertilizers and then the soil is getting degraded by the day. It's getting toxic, and the yield is becoming reduced by the days. I'm not theorizing, something we see all the time. So there is a need for us to think about, to have a rethink about the way we manage those resources. And the only approach to it would be for us to combine. It's a combination of the two, both Western and local knowledge. We need to see how to blend these approaches together for farmers to be able to get along and get good results. So that's my comments regarding that question there. I cannot remember the third one. Maybe you need to remind me.
I guess you already answered it because it has to do with that local technology. So blending the regional, very West-based with the local ones might get a better output than each of them separately.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tayin. And yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. So I'll try and add. I agree with much of what Tayin just said, but I'll try to add a few points on two of the questions. So what's useful from the Green Revolution experience, if we are to try and identify? You know, my view is quite skeptical, as you might have realized, but if I'm to think hard of what is useful from this experience, I would emphasize the unprecedented investment in public research. I think that's an important thing, and that should remain an important thing, just to ensure that there's enough public funding to support research in the agri-food sector. But the question is whether this funding, and it's been very generous in the case of Brazil, whether this is funding the right set of projects. And I've already raised questions about how problematic I think the mentality within a great part of Embrapa is. in terms of not being open to a diversity of knowledges, despite the fact that inside the organization we find quite a lot of interesting experiences, but they are sort of the exception, and they're seen as you know, by sort of the dominant forces within the organization. They're not very well received. Those colleagues working with being part of networks on agroecology, working with farmers to devise innovations that suit particular contexts. This is not usually seen as real science. So it's quite problematic the way that the organization is organized from within, and what's considered real science and what's not viewed as valid knowledge creation processes. So that's one thing. But then the other problem that I think one would need to discuss when thinking about a publicly funded research organization is the social function that such organizations should play, something that I mentioned at the start. And that is really an open debate in Brazil. The question of whether if this organization is funded by public money, whether it should really be supported, whether it should have a redistributive function and be supporting those farmers and other actors in the system that are more marginalized and disadvantaged, the ones that the private sector won't look after. So a big question of whether then public research should prioritize working with a particular subset and address issues of justice, equity, and environmental sustainability, of course. So on the second question of how, I guess, the Green Revolution proponents have engaged with the climate and environmental agenda, I think in two ways. By looking back and using the sustainability idea to reinforce the epic by arguing that the Green Revolution has actually spared land from being incorporated into production process. So the Green Revolution as having reached that objective. So completely disregarding then the losses in biodiversity, the losses in terms of soil fertility, water resources, and so on, which are so well documented in the Brazilian Cerrado in particular. So looking back and claiming that the Green Revolution saved land from being incorporated into the production process, that's one argument. But then the sustainability and climate agenda is also used to suggest that the established institutions of the Green Revolution are the ones who should propose solutions to address the climate emergency. And you see, for example, Embrapa coming up with a list of brand new technologies that are promising that. And these include, they come under the label of low carbon agriculture, climate smart, and so on, integrated agriculture, forestry, and livestock systems. There's a range of technologies, and the problem is not with the goals that are associated with these technologies. We would all agree that when it comes to increasing production, if it's in a sustainable way, and increasing yields, that should all be desirable. The problem is with the model, with the processes associated with these technologies in terms of who benefits from them, who are the types of farmers that are able to actually incorporate what is usually quite sophisticated ideas that are quite demanding in terms of resources, in terms of all sorts of things, time. And if they're not able to take advantage of these technologies, who will? So I think the problem is about process and about who gets to benefit from these ideas. And I think it is the few rather than the many. And that's why I think, the whole paradigm is quite problematic, fundamentally problematic.
Fascinating insights, because it's very difficult to gain this kind of analysis just from surface. When the few are benefited and the many are not, then there's a root problem. Okay, thank you very much, Lidia. Netza, I'm not sure where I should read them, the questions that are posed by people attending the meeting. Oh, here it is. So Amado, Carlos, okay, I will try to. So hello, what challenges? Oh, this we already talked about this. How come that no one mentions South Africa, which in African country quite similar to those where the Green Revolution began Mexico? Well, they just don't mention it. But if you want to add any insight, Toyin or Lidia, about South Africa and how the Green Revolution developed there, I'm not sure I know anything about it.
Yeah, let me respond to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, my apologies for not making South Africa a case study, which of course is very close to me. It's my neighbor, but unfortunately I overlooked it. Yeah, of course, South Africa seems to be a trailblazer, but perhaps why I seem to be a bit biased about their GR is the issue of GMOs, which of course is something that we contend with all the time. If you take a look at the Green Revolution of South Africa, I think is GMOs focused somehow, and there is nothing wrong with GMOs if things are done properly. We just need to be sure that we are not doing the wrong thing, if I may put it that way. So basically, if I may put it in another way, South Africa has done a lot in terms of food reliance, at least. Botswana, for instance, relies solely upon the food that comes from South Africa. Most of the food that we get in Botswana come from South Africa. But the issue is the GMO thing is for me, I may not be arguing on a personal ground, but there are so many schools of thought who feel that GMO should be carefully looked into, and in relation to the well-being of local communities and biodiversity. And that is the point at which I'm coming from, that if we tend to push for a GMO product, what then becomes of the future of our biodiversity, which is quite significant. Of course, South Africa again blazes the trail when it comes to pushing for indigenous knowledge, which of course seems to be a paradox. If you talk about mainstreaming local knowledge, South Africa is playing a good role in terms of that. So I'm not too sure where the meeting point is between pushing for genetically modified organisms and then bringing in local knowledge, because the two seems to be opposite. Personally speaking, I may be wrong. So, but in a nutshell, I think South Africa appears to be a success story in a way, if in the context in which I just discussed. So I don't know whether Lidia wants to add to that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it looks always like success stories are hidden by aggregated narratives, but inside we have pretty much complicated stuff. So Diana, you're raising your hands. Do you want to take the word?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would like to say thank you very much for such great presentations. I think the order of the exposition was excellent, as we have an awesome transition from our last session devoted to South America and this one to Africa. Precisely on the subject of continental connections and Lidia's research, I would like to ask her to talk more about the discourses that presents parallels between Brazil, Ghana, and Mozambique. I find it interesting because a first narrative of the Green Revolution was based on the idea that the technological package could be applied in very different spaces, while in your case of studies present a justification in similarities. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, go ahead, presenters.
I think the question is for Lidia.
I'm so very sorry, but I'm having some trouble with my monitor here, I seem to have lost the last bit of Diana's question. So sorry, Diana, if you could repeat again.
Yes, of course. I would like to know more about the discourses that presents parallels between Brazil, Ghana, and Mozambique. Because the first narrative of the Green Revolution was based on the idea that the package, the technological package, could be applied in very different spaces, while your cases of studies shows a different justification, a different narrative based on the idea of similarities.
I think the point about similarities has been quite convenient from the diplomatic level. First, by claiming similarities between development contexts, shared struggles, and then similarities related to soils, climate, and so on. So that latter idea that Brazil and particular parts of Africa have similar biophysical conditions has really been quite influential and led scientists and technicians to conclude the same technologies that we've used in Brazil can be simply transferred to the African context, regardless of the social fabric, the political setting, the other circumstances that determine whether technologies are relevant, are taken up, and can ever be play any sort of meaningful role in a context. So that has all been quite problematic. If you look at the particular experiences with projects and with scientific adaptation initiatives that go on as part of these exchanges between Embrapa, different parts of Embrapa and countries like Ghana, Mozambique, many countries where Embrapa has had interactions with. What you typically see is some processes being borrowed from Brazil, taken into these contexts, but staying within the realm of labs and experimentation fields. So this has really been a conversation between scientists, between peers, but really failing to connect with the destination context and trying to check whether these crops, these technologies were the ones that were most adequate to address constraints that farmers were feeling, constraints that the population overall was feeling in terms of food security and so on. So I think these have been very narrow minded experiments from the point of view of trying to insert them in the in local context and make them more relevant to people in those destination countries. But there are other problems. So there are problems with the logic of these projects and how, what particular technologies are selected and so on, that I think are narrowly framed. But there's also the typical problems that emerge with development aid initiatives, where there's a lot of misconceptions about each other, each of the sides of the cooperation, including misunderstandings about the objectives, about what each side had to gain. So a lot of issues of miscommunication, failed unmet expectations. But also, I remember talking to some of the Embrapa specialists involved in the cooperation projects, and they've always talked about the frustration of getting their peers to interact with them because there was a culture of, there was an expectation that Brazil that the cooperation programs would provide some material benefits to people interacting in projects in the form of, just resources to conduct their work, or cars, or opportunities to travel to Brazil and so on. And if that was not available, then the incentive to be part of the projects wasn't there. And the fundamental problem is that the projects didn't initiate from the Africa side. They were kind of presented to people across the continent, and governments simply accepted these projects as a good idea. But it was never something that emerged from the ground up. Has always been, regardless of talks about horizontal cooperation between Brazil and African countries, I don't think that that's been the reality of these cooperation engagements. So sorry, long answer, but hopefully I've addressed some of your point.
Yeah, totally. Then, oops, sorry about this. Wait. Sorry, I have a problem with my mic. So we have 3 more questions. The first one is for Lidia from Rajesvari Raina. Very good presentation. May I ask you if you would include great scientists and their political power over and above scientific authority, like Professor Goldenberg, and also want to know more about Brazil's and India's, or just like India's, hankering for using science and technology for shifting their economies from developing to developed. Would you say the Green Revolution is just a part of this obsession with economic growth? Rajesvari is pushing all the right buttons, so it's for you, Lidia.
Yes, to that last question. I think the stories of green revolutions that we talked about, and the ones that we haven't, are filled with individuals, with heroic individuals, and that's what I, in the work with my colleagues, Punapende and Shuli Shu, we try to emphasize that this is quite problematic. The idea that there are these heroic figures that play this central role in powering these transformative initiatives. I should also say that the histories of agricultural science and technology are filled with heroic male figures. There's very little talk about roles of women scientists, and that's not surprisingly because there's few of them. But there is an obsession with these fatherly figures, which I think is quite problematic. And in fact, in our work, we're trying to move away from just this obsession with individuals, regardless of the important scientific contributions that they have made, and it's not to diminish their role, their contributions, and their dedication. But I think we need to talk more about more collective experiments that shift the focus away from the scientists and into the farmers, the people on the ground. That should be the center of the conversation, rather than just continuing to emphasize the role of these very elitist operators in the system. That I think the Green Revolution, and us talking again and again about Green Revolution, just reinforces their status, their privileged status. So I think we need to, of course, recognize the contributions of individuals, but try and avoid just obsessing about heroic fatherly figures wherever they are in the world, and talk more about collectives, about farmers, about women, about other social categories that need to be at the front of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Lidia. Netza, you're raising your hand.
Yes, well, I have a question for Tejin. It's about the place of self-sufficiency and the Green Revolution in Africa. And they're wrong because, for example, in the case of Mexico, the Green Revolution started before the 1940s, 1950s, and one of the main objectives was the self-sufficiency, but because the Second War. But after that, maybe the 60s, 70s, the objective changed, because from that point, the Green Revolution was one of the objectives was the impulse for producing more agricultural goods to export, to the United States. So In the case of Africa, it seems like they started after the Green Revolution, and it seems like for that reason, the Green Revolution was more involved and impulse the produce of food for exporting to Europe or other countries. So, which is the place of the self-sufficiency in the Green Revolution in Africa? And well, I have another question for Lidia. It's about if the funding of the process of intervention of ENMAPA in Mozambique, because it seems like it's a different moment, a geopolitical moment. And I don't know if it's a merge of different projects there, maybe, different interests, not only the United States, like in the Green Revolution in the 20th century, Brazil, China, European Union, and United States. I don't know if you can add some information for understanding which is the exactly moment, the geopolitical moment of this intervention of ENMAPA. That's all.
Yeah, thanks, Guterres, Professor. If I heard you clearly, you were asking the role of self-sufficiency in production within the context of Green Revolution in Africa. Yes, in my brief presentation, I mentioned the attention that was put on cash crop economy at the expense of staples, which you mentioned as well. I think what we need to do and what is beginning to happen now in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, which I use as a case study, is that attention is beginning to be placed on small farmers because the government is beginning to realize that without the small farmers, we might not be able to get anywhere in terms of food production. I mentioned the issue of e-wallet as one of those new initiatives that just came about in the last few years in Nigeria. And the intention, the thrust of that initiative is to make small farmers to have access to agricultural inputs without necessarily going through middlemen who happen to be rent seekers. As I mentioned, you see, there are so many people who are just there to truncate the process because of their own selfish ulterior motives. But that initiative is meant to take away or to block that process, such that farmers have access to information on where to access agricultural inputs for them to be able to produce food crops as demanded. So my response to your question is that not until we begin to think about going back to the roots, to the beginning. I mentioned the fact that Nigeria used to be one of the best producers of cocoa in those days, but things changed when oil was discovered. Nigeria used to be one of the best, in fact, Nigeria was the best producer of palm oil, so to say. Then when oil came, when they discovered crude oil, then everything changed. So what we are saying is that that model that was used in those days, in which production was based on a comparative advantage. Nigeria, for instance, have about 3 major regions: the North, the West, and the South. In the South, cash crops like cocoa, like rubber, like coffee, those are the kind of crop that you find in the tropical rainforest in the South. When you go up north, you have groundnut or cowpeas and things like that, stuff like that, which farmers used to produce en masse. So essentially then when you go to the eastern part of Nigeria, you'll find out that oil palm production is a huge thing in those days. So not until we redirect our green revolution towards the law of comparative advantage for each region to specialize on the products that they are good at, we may not be able to achieve anything. And I think perhaps because of the exigencies of the moment, the government is beginning to realize that we need to go back to the drawing board. and focus attention on the production of crops that we are good at, that farmers can produce easily without any problem, and giving them the enabling environment to participate in the process. That's what that new initiative that I just mentioned is all about. The e-wallet thing, which will make farmers to have access to production resources without necessarily going through middlemen, such that they will be able to produce their products without much action. Whether that is going to whether it's going to be realized, we're still trying to see what happens in the next few years down the line. So I think that's the response that I have for you. I hope it answers your question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Professor Kolawole. I believe that your pretty clear answer already, or intervention already answered one of the questions that it's about. How about traditional seed management, against biotech imported seeds? So that was clearly addressed there. It was from an anonymous attendee. And we have one last complex question by Antonio Chamorro using Diana's account. So it has different aspects. I will try to synthesize some of these. So the first one is there any, it's very particular, is there any connection between the Nigerian Institute for Oil Palm Research and Embrapa, link on the exchange of oil palm genetic materials, such as Piscifera pollen? But yeah, and what about the local use of palm in Africa in contrast with the industrial use? So it's pretty much what you, Toyin, was describing, but now you can give an in-depth view on this particular topic of palm oil. That's the first one. Then, besides, the tropics have played a long and important role to supply the needs of the global north since colonial times, and they have been key for agro-industrial development, what has been implemented with extreme violence. So could the future or the new green revolution in Africa implement it without considering this previous context? In line with this, is green revolution a possible framework for cultural and ecological emancipation, or it is needed, as Cabral pointed, a new approach? And how could we do this considering the dominant technological frame and the influence from the green revolution framework? I know what the answer is for this, but I will let Lidia answer. The first one, I guess, I'm not sure if Toyin or Lidia are aware about this particular palm oil issue with Embrapa and Nigeria. And the second, I guess, we've discussed that is do we need a new approach, or it could be blended with local regionalized practices and we get something better than any of the previous one before?
Yeah, no, I think I kind of answered that question before. I think we need a different model. I don't think we need a singular. Africa doesn't need a singular module because the continent is so diverse. So any continent-wide solution, I think, can be quite problematic. But I think the green revolution needs to be. I don't think it can be a model. And it does have connections with the previous past that is very problematic as well for the continent in particular. Perhaps I would only say that I don't want to completely dismiss the idea of a South-South dialogue. I think there's a lot of potential, and a lot of potential for Embrapa to have a dialogue with similar research organizations across the continent. I think that could be quite fruitful, but it's a question of finding the right type of experiences that can be useful. And I don't think that 20 years of scientific cooperation has really mobilized the right people, the right resources, and the right experiences from Brazil. I think the dialogue has been very dominated by the dominant forces in the organization that have selected success stories that are, I would question whether they are success at all, and whether they are the ones that could be useful across Africa. But I still believe that there's a lot of potential for dialogue, for trying to work out, working on developing capacities, on exchanges that are truly mutual, because I think Brazil itself has potentially a lot to gain from this interaction with very diverse agri-food systems across Africa. So I don't think, I think there's a need for that dialogue to go two ways. And the idea that Embrapa is the authority on tropical agriculture, and it's I don't think that's very helpful. So yes, to South-South scientific cooperation and exchanges, but more but of a different kind. And this is not to say there are interesting cases of attempts to have a more horizontal type of dialogue where you see Embrapa researchers who truly are interested in learning as well. But those are exceptions and not really the sort of the dominant feature of scientific cooperation in Africa, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, clear enough. Toyin, do you want to add anything else?
Yes, the first part of the question is about some kind of socio-cultural linkage between organizations like NIFO and Embrapa. I must confess that I told you the story about how Malaysians went to Nigeria to collect germplasm of oil palm, and today Malaysia happens to be the best producer of palm oil in the world. I wouldn't know how the framework was put in place to achieve that. But having said that, I think it's something that could be looked into in the new framework that we're discussing, such that there could be this benefit between countries and not just even organizations. If Malaysia went to Nigeria to collect germplasm and is doing much better than Nigeria today, what can Nigeria gain from Malaysia itself to better improve on what it has presently? Of course, I gave you the reason why things began to turn haywire, because Nigeria decided to forget about crop production because of because of crude oil, which of course has become a cost for the country. So having said that, I think again there is this part of the question that says that what about the local use of palm in Africa in contrast with industrial use? And I think that's where the issue of value addition comes in. If we look inward because I know that there are several indigenous technologies that are being used by local people in processing oil palm into diverse products like cream pomade, soap, bar soap, and so many things that they do with that product. So I'm saying that part of what the Green Revolution can look into actually is to address the issue of value additions, because if Africa in the first place is going to be relevant in the globalization equation, so to say, we need to have products to sell to the rest of the world. And if we are not going to look into the issues of value additions, then it might become problematic again, because if Africa doesn't do what it needs to do, it will continue to be dependent on the rest of the world, which is not going to go well in the long run. So that's my comment about that. I don't know whether there is any other thing that I need to add. Of course, you talked about, in line with this, is Green Revolution a possible framework for cultural and ecological emancipation, or is it needed, as Cabral pointed, as a new approach? Of course, the Green Revolution can be a possible framework for cultural and ecological emancipation if emphasis is not placed on monoculture, as I said. When emphasis is placed on monoculture agriculture, then it's going to continue to be a problem, because in the process of trying to push for a particular product, a crop, then biodiversity is jeopardized, and that affects all other dimensions of the lives of the local producers. So I don't think we'll be able to achieve anything except we look into the areas of how to address the issue of polyculture. We need to allow farmers to thrive in their own environment, and at the same time still be able to key into the equation of the green revolution that we're trying to push. So coming back to the issue again, the small farmers should be the center of attention. How do we help them to make things happen for the economy? Because they are the majority of the people in the production process. And if we don't allow them to realize their potential, it's going to be difficult to achieve that main goal in the end. So much for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dayan. Looks like the new green revolution must have a big if above. Okay, we are on time. So thank you very much. It was an honor meeting you, Lidia and Toyin. Anytime you come to Mexico, please let me know. You will have a place to crash, and the university is open to both of you. So thank you very much. It was an honor. And I hope that you all support for Argentina in the next match against Croatia. And now I leave you with the organizer. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks for all the questions and comments. And a pleasure to meet Toya as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. And of course, I'm happy to see Lidia, who happens to be at IDS now. I was there briefly between 2007 and 2008. It was a good experience for me. I still have my home in Brighton. So
it's a small world.
Yeah. So thanks to everybody for listening to us, and I hope that we'll still cross paths.
Yeah.
Thank you.